Hello, and welcome to Green Signals Episode 5, with me, Nigel Harris, here in lovely Lincolnshire, where the autumn trees are all showing the tints on this cold but very bright day, and
me, Richard Bowker, in actually equally glorious Derbyshire, where it's cold, it's clear, and it's lovely.
Indeed. So, thanks for so many amazing comments that you've sent us following last week's show, episode 4, in which we had the expert's expert on fares and ticketing, the man in seat 61, Mark Smith, as our guest. Now, Mark's comments generated a lot of chatter on Twitter. Chatter on Twitter, sounds good, doesn't it? And LinkedIn, and we'll certainly be asking Mark back again at some point. Always a pleasure to hear him talk about fares and ticketing, and what a pity that the government and Treasury don't listen to him as well. Our deep dive into all things fares and ticketing included the decision announced just 6 hours before, on the day we recorded the show, abandoning the government's controversial plans to close up to 1,000 ticket offices in England. Now, Richard caused something of a stir by telling the... Good on you, Richard. Keep stirring, mate. Caused something of a stir by telling the industry, I paraphrase, to get off its knees, find its collective voice, and start pushing vigorously back on Treasury and DfT micromanagement, especially after ministers threw the train operators under the proverbial bus in its U-turn scrapping of the ticket office closures plan. Richard also made a superb point that we shouldn't be talking about privatisation and nationalisation, but what we really need is a return to professional management while we've still got enough seasoned and experienced professional railway managers to get us out the mess we're in. It all left a really sour taste, and whilst remaining discreet, the Toks are known to have been furious at this DfT betrayal, which is what it was, and rightly so. Clearly, the show struck a ringing and resonant chord with listeners and viewers on YouTube, and there were some terrific responses from Green Signal. Here's just a few. Tony Wilson said, quote, "Very enjoyable pod again, fellas. Mark Smith certainly explained the current ticketing process and the best way to improve and simplify the whole thing. Carry on the good work." Thanks, Tony. We will. Malcolm Brooks said, Can Mark Smith be Prime Minister and you two could be Chancellor and Minister for Transport? We'll have to fight over who does what, Richard. You couldn't do a worse job, and probably much, much better. And a certain Graham Eccles of this parish, he said, again, a good programme. Mark as knowledgeable as ever. Praise indeed from a tough chap to impress. We should have Graham as a guest fairly soon, do you think, Richard?
Oh, do you know what? We definitely should. I've got to say, there's 4 people who, as operators, I used to kind of pin back my ears and listen when they ever were speaking. You know, Bob Braitwell was one, Chris Green, Gordon Pettit,
indeed,
and Graham Eccles. So I think he'd be terrific to have on the show.
And of Green Signals overall, my very dear friend, steam fireman extraordinaire Joanne Crompton said, "No nonsense, straight to the point discussions about all things rail related from Richard and Nigel, all subjects current and past." And by the way, before any pearl clutching starts, fireman is how Jo insists on describing herself. So thanks to all, we really do appreciate the feedback. So, Green Signals in Parliament again. We usually record the show at the weekend, although last week was different because we had the Transport Focus report into ticket offices. But by the time this episode is actually uploaded and available, Richard and I will have been at the Transport Select Committee, to which we've both been invited to give evidence as witnesses. They're looking into HS2 and, in particular, the recent decision to scrap HS2 North. We'll tell you how that went next week, and hopefully we'll both emerge unscathed. By the way, TSC Chair Ian Stewart MP invited Richard and I to go and give evidence after hearing Green Signals Episode 2, HS2's Top 10 Myths, which, if you missed it, is still available as an audio file on your podcast provider of choice, or there's a video version on YouTube. The video pod is proving to be surprisingly popular, considering all you get to look at is Richard and me. But hey, the market's deciding, Richard, so
Of course.
they must like us, watching us,
Yeah.
so they're very welcome to pop along. Richard, incidentally, without blowing too much sunshine his way, did a superb interview on the West Coast Main Line's continuing and increasing unreliability on Radio 4 Today on Saturday, November the 4th, in which he was name-checked in the intro on this agenda-setting programme as a presenter at Green Signals. We are fantastically proud to have achieved such wonderful awareness less than a month after launch. We'll put a link to the programme on BBC Sounds, if it's possible to do that,
Yep.
on the blog page of
Yeah, we can do that.
resources we put up after each issue, so you can dig a bit deeper into stuff.
Yep.
It was a quite a lengthy, chunky interview, and Richard did a great job of putting the point across. So today we have a quick look at potential judicial review into the Prime Minister's dreadful decision to cancel HS2 north of Birmingham to Crewe and Manchester. Now we hear a lot about judicial review in news stories, and Richard explains what the oft-discussed JR process actually is and what it might achieve. It isn't actually what many people think it is, so stay tuned. Our big guest interview is with Mark Hopwood CBE, Managing Director of Great Western Railway since 2008, so Mark's a real survivor and this'll be good. As well as being a Class 50 and Boeing 747 superfan, Mark is one of the most experienced TOC MDs in the country, whose 34-year, thus far, career goes back to 1989 as a Telephone Enquiry Bureau clerk at Reading. So, that's your podcast for today. So let's get into it. Could there be a JR of the HS2 decision? Perhaps unsurprisingly, there's been much talk of a possible legal challenge into the Prime Minister's damaging decision to cancel HS2 North, perhaps triggered by the DfT Permanent Secretary's admission that the Parliamentary Act enabling Phase 2A from Birmingham to Crewe will need to be repealed. And that can be a time-consuming process, I understand, or maybe it's not. Richard will tell us. There are many misconceptions about JRs. People think that they can change a decision, and they can't. Richard?
Thanks. It is quite a tricky area, this, and I should just say I'm not a lawyer, and I'm certainly not a constitutional law expert by any means. But I have actually been through the pre-application phase of judicial review, both as a potential applicant and as a respondent. So a little bit of knowledge about it. So what is judicial review? Judicial review is basically where you go to court and ask the court to overturn a decision taken by a public body, and in this case it would be the government. Now, what the court can't do is say, yeah, I agree, I wouldn't have made that decision. I think the outcome was the wrong one, or you didn't like it, so I agree with you. The whole point of judicial review is to test whether the process that had been followed by the government was, or in this case, the government was correct. You have to, first of all, you have to get permission to bring a judicial review. It's interesting, I think only about 5% of people who try and get a judicial review are given permission to bring one. So it's quite difficult to do. And there's basically three grounds for judicial review. One is that the decision was unlawful. You'll sometimes hear a phrase called ultra vires. So the government or the public body didn't actually have the legal right to make the decision. That it was procedurally, second one is that it was procedurally unfair or defective in some way. And the third one, which I think will probably have people's ears pricking up, is irrationality, right? So how might somebody bring a judicial review against the decision on HS2? Well, we don't know, or I'm not aware yet. I think the irrationality one is quite difficult. So to get a judicial review on the grounds of irrationality, the bar is very high because you've got to demonstrate that no reasonable person acting reasonably could ever have come to that decision. That was quite hard. But the ultra-virus point is potentially quite interesting. You know, did they have the power to do it? And that kind of brings you on to the point you just made there, Nigel, about the Act and whether or not it needs to be repealed. Now, the Act, when we say the Act, we're talking about the Phase 2A Act, so the bit from Birmingham to Crewe. So Phase 1, the bit they're building, that's got an Act and they're doing it, and they've got all the land together and they're making it happen. The bit from Crewe to Manchester is still going through Parliament. It's only a hybrid bill. So the bit we're talking about is the Birmingham to Crewe bit, where there is an Act. And I can't remember the name of it. It's something like the Birmingham to Crewe High-Speed Rail Act or something like that. And the question is, does that have to be repealed? Well, it's an enabling act. So that doesn't... An enabling acts usually mean you can do something, but you don't have to do something. So some people, I guess, believe it won't need to be repealed. However, there is a view, I've heard said by a number of people, that Parliament spent such a long time debating, considering the whole of that bit of railway before they passed the Act, that Parliament expected it to then go and get built. So, you know, you probably might need to think, well, actually, if Parliament has that expectation, we can't just sit in a party conference in Manchester and go, do you know what, we're not going to do it anymore. So that's why it may need to go back to Parliament. And I think Bernadette Kelly, the Permanent Secretary, has said there'll need to be an act of repeal. There's another good reason for doing it, of course. Land has got to be acquired. And whilst the Act is still on the statute book, I suspect there's an argument that some of the land that is still yet to be acquired, or even some of the land that's already been acquired, could be blighted, statutorily blighted, because the Act is still on the statute books. So the one thing I think we can be absolutely certain, if the Prime Minister thought that just standing up and saying, I've cancelled it, was the end of his problems, I think that was a mistake. I think this has still got quite a long way to run.
So it could get bogged down in the same argument over a long period. It's interesting you said about the Parliament having an expectation, especially when you consider the intensity, depth, length of the debate in advance of the vote and the very solid vote. Every vote in Parliament has been sort of cross-party and enthusiastically in favour of HS2, so there could be a good argument. Well, we'll keep our finger on this pulse, Richard, but
certainly will.
Thanks for shining a bit of a light in our darkness there. That's always appreciated. And now let's move on to our big interview. It's our deep dive time, and welcome to Mark Hopwood CBE. From an inquiry clerk in 1989 to GWRMD since 2008, Mark's roles have been pretty varied. He's been station manager at Slough. He was a passenger negotiations manager, excuse me, for Railtrack at Euston. Railtrack, remember them? Ops director for First North Western at Manchester. It's a 3-page CV, and you can find it on our blog page to see what Mark's full range of activities been, and it is a very full range of activity. He even finds time to be president of the Cholsey and Wallingford Railway, a director of the Institution of Railway Operators and deputy chair of the Railway Ball. A family man with 2 young daughters, he even finds time to be a DJ and presenter as a volunteer for Hospital Radio Basingstoke. I mean, I'm exhausted, Mark, just reading out the list. He was then appointed CBE by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II in 2021. So let's get stuck in. Richard Bowker, also CBE, and I have to say I'm feeling a bit left out here, is going to kick things off for us.
Absolutely. Well, welcome, Mark, and it's great to have you on the show. I just want to start with one thing that we've talked about a couple of times now on this podcast, which is this sort of separation between in the profit and loss account between who's responsible for cost and who's responsible for income. Because obviously the DFT look after cost and the Treasury get the income, and that must make being a TOC MD really quite difficult, because if you want to come up with a bright idea, it must be really hard to get it done. I mean, is it causing a real issue? And if it is, what on earth can we do about it? What do you do to kind of manage around that?
Well, first of all, hello, and great to be here. Thanks for the invitation, and great to see you guys getting your podcast off the ground and it doing so well. Hopefully, more and more people will listen. I think it's a really good question, Richard. And I mean, fundamentally, the railway is a business. Now, whether the railways run in the public or the private sector as a business, it's still a business. We're providing a service to people who pay their money to us, and obviously we have costs that we incur in running that business. And I just struggle to understand why we should be any different to any other business. Whether someone's running a bicycle shop or a Sainsbury's supermarket or an airline or anything else, nobody else separates their costs and their revenue in a way like that. And actually, you need to make trade-offs between the two and say, well, if I spend a bit of money, I can drive my income in a certain way. And you just corrupt the whole system, I think, by separating it. And it was something that happened during the COVID period, I think, for perhaps understandable reasons. But we've come through COVID now. That's history. And I think there's a lot of focus, quite rightly, on the finances of the industry, and people want to see less taxpayers' support. And we can achieve that by some focus on cost reduction. But I think our biggest opportunity to achieve that is actually by driving our revenue. I think particularly in a business like mine, over half my revenue now comes from leisure customers. Well beyond half, sort of 70% nearly of our revenue.
Has that always been like that? Is that a relatively recent phenomenon then?
It's changed slightly, Richard, but Great Western in the shape that it's in, I mean, even before COVID, about 51% of our revenue was leisure travel. And of course that balance has been one of the things that's changed quite considerably since the pandemic. So I think we understand there needed to be some different arrangements in place through COVID. But now, what I want to be doing is making my business as successful as possible, bringing as much revenue as possible in, so that I can actually have as little call on taxpayer support as possible. And it would be nice to be able to be left to get on with that with my management team.
So if we go back to, say, the time just after privatisation, and like you, I'm not making a statement saying privatisation's better, and that's not the point. What happened immediately after that was train companies said we need to run more frequent and reliable services. So, hourlies became half hourlies and so on and so forth. And if you run a really quite boring but frequent and reliable service, the money comes in. Do we need to kind of get back to that? It feels as if we're kind of looking at, when you're constantly sort of chopping out, that's going to have the opposite effect.
Yeah, and at the moment, there's pretty much a view, certainly in the Treasury, that we shouldn't be running any more services at all, whereas actually there are actually some routes, some commuter operations where that's probably a sensible outcome. But there are some leisure flows. I mean, in my business, we think that the growth that we've seen now justifies potentially going back to a service, Richard, that you instructed us to strike out of Oxford to Bristol. The market between sort of Bath and Oxford, Bristol, very strong. East West Rail is coming towards us, and that will improve the connectivity at Oxford. But at the moment, the structure doesn't really support that type of thing. And I think, I absolutely understand that the railway's absorbing huge amounts of taxpayers' support, and there's a very strong desire in the Treasury to bring that down. And I don't think that's unreasonable. I think the question is how we get there. And actually, even in British Rail days, British Rail had control of its P&L.
It does, and I agree. And it does feel as if that is a big block at the moment. Totally agree. I mean, there's nothing wrong with wanting to control costs, and that's sensible, and that's what good businesses do. It's how you then generate the cash to be able to make it more viable. That kind of leads us, I think, Nigel, nicely on to talking about reform.
Yeah, it does. Your point about the Treasury, Mark, really reinforces Richard's point made in the last green signals that the entire focus is on cost. There's no interest at all in revenue, which is a ridiculous situation to be in. You and I were both at the Bradshaw lecture back in February when Mark Harper stood there and got the room on his side by saying that managing directors should be able to manage and direct more than they were at the moment. Do you feel since February any more able to both manage and direct?
Sadly, I don't, and I foolishly got myself very excited back in February that
Me too.
I thought we were heading towards perhaps an opportunity to start changing things. And this, one of the things about this is that I've not met anybody who actually thinks this is a good idea. I mean, I have heard a rumour that one of the Treasury officials who's behind this lives on my network. I won't say where, in case anyone goes and gets him. But I have pondered the idea of getting up one morning and heading out there to perhaps meet him on the train for a conversation. But yeah, I mean, nobody, even I think, in fairness, the Secretary of State and the Rail Minister don't think this is a sensible way to structure things. And the Secretary of State clearly wanted to change it. And if he wants to change it and he hasn't, you have to ask, well, why might that be? And I guess the reason is that he's being stopped by people in the Treasury and in Number 10.
As we've got the most anti-rail Prime Minister I think we've ever seen. OK, so what do we do about it? Is GBR still the answer, or do we need something different? I mean, a guiding mind is one thing, but given the depth of the mess we're in, do we need something a bit more, deterministic to shift the needle, break the inertia and actually get things moving?
Well, I think, I've been giving this quite a lot of thought over recent months, and I guess all of us have got our own sort of view of exactly what type of structure we think would work best. But I think the thing for me now is that, things are in such a concerning situation that I think any structure that actually allowed the industry to get on and run the day-to-day activity and left the politicians and DfT to focus on the high-level finance and policy would be a good idea. And of course, GBR looked like it was going to move forward and then didn't, and it needs legislation. I know that people in the GBR transition team have done quite a detailed piece of work that says, what could we achieve without legislation, and could we use something that's very sort of technical and boring, but what's called a statutory instrument, which is a process that goes through Parliament that isn't quite as difficult to manage as legislation. And they believe they could make some progress, but again, that's been blocked and stalled. So I think the reality, as far as I can see, sadly, is that we're not going to see any change in structure until we get to the next general election, which is, somewhere between sort of 12 and 15 months away, or 12 and 14 months away.
I mean, you said in the last, I think the last episode, Richard, when we were doing the West Coast route mod, that Alistair Darling, as Secretary of State, stood back, trusted you, let you get on with it, and just said, just don't leave me with egg on my face. That would be a luxurious position to be in now, wouldn't it?
It would. He was very careful to make sure that he wasn't going to get left with egg on his face. So nobody should think he was sort of laissez-faire about it. It was actually he was on it, to coin a phrase. But there was a structure, and there was an element of kind of empowerment, which I think is kind of what Mark's referring to. There's no sort of kind of sense of empowerment, and I do find it, I suppose, slightly depressing actually, that encouraging in a way that Department for Transport ministers get it and at least understands that there needs to be some more empowerment, but we use the phrase that the dead hand of the Treasury is preventing that, and that's only going to make their problem worse.
And number 10. Well, look, it'd be very easy to depress ourselves, wouldn't it? It's not all bad news, of course. Mark is in the luxurious position at Paddington of sitting astride Britain's busiest railway, which now accounts for, I think, 6% of all national carrying. So over to you on that one, Richard.
Yeah. Is that? It'd be fascinating to hear Mark's, because I thought the Elizabeth line was obviously what we're referring to, which is a triumph in so many ways. Was accounting for something like one in six of every passenger journey now on the network. I mean, understandably so, because it's taken over. Elizabeth line is a lot of what was sort of suburban services before, so that's sort of slightly odd. But Elizabeth line, Mark, congratulations.
Absolutely.
Let's face it, it wasn't just a TfL project. It was a massive undertaking to get so much integrated together. Just tell us how that happened. It was a triumph, but I'll bet behind the scenes there was an awful lot of hard work and sleepless nights.
Yeah, and I think certainly if you look back over that project, there's certainly some things that you'd want to do differently. But I think, it was a good example of people having to come together and work together. And of course, people often think Elizabeth Line is a new railway, which in central London it is. But of course, out on the Great Eastern and on Great Western, it's using existing infrastructure. And the other thing they did very cleverly was they used some bits of the old Silverlink network that I managed many years ago to get through the Connaught tunnels and out on the Abbey Wood line, which is a fascinating story in itself. But I think on Great Western, of course, the work was going on at the same time that we were embarking on electrification of the wider Great Western network, rebuilding Reading Station. And of course, the Great Western electrification project hasn't had the best reputation, and probably deservedly so in some respects. But Reading Station reconstruction was a great success. Actually, it came in a year early and came in under budget, which is not something you hear too often about a major project. And of course, the reconstruction of Reading was what actually allowed us to review the whole proposition for the Elizabeth line, which at the time we were talking of as Crossrail, to actually extend it beyond Maidenhead. Because not everyone knows, but originally there was a plan that I was going to run a diesel shuttle from Slough to Reading every 30 minutes, and Crossrail would only go to Maidenhead. And it was great actually to work with everyone in the industry to generate a proposition that went to government and got approved to actually extend those trains through to Reading. And it's certainly proving to be a great success. I think obviously the reason that those usage figures are so impressive is partly because there's some new passengers, partly, as you've said, Richard, it's existing rail passengers, but also a lot of London Underground passengers. It's not well reported, but actually the Jubilee and Central lines have actually reduced their service levels slightly since the introduction of the Elizabeth line, because so many people have moved across, and a lot of the Piccadilly line business from Heathrow has moved across. And I think it does show the power of the TfL brand, actually, that a lot of those services were there before, but the connectivity with Central London and getting them on the tube map and so on, tremendously powerful. But yeah, there's a lot of working together to get the railway electrified, building things like the Acton dive under. I've mentioned Reading Station. Sadly, one or two bits of investment like Slough and Maidenhead stations cut back a bit at the end, so that still needs to be finished off. But I think the passenger numbers do speak for themselves, and you're seeing huge growth. And a lot of the stations on the line of route now, it's quite interesting looking at the amount of development that's going on, that those stations are now seen as really attractive stations. The residential and commercial property market around those stations doing well. So yeah, GWR is obviously not operating the Elizabeth line, but I think it's also transformed our business at the London end. Our customers who get into Paddington now have got a much better option for getting through to Central and East London. It used to be the worst connected London termini, and a higher percentage of our customers actually travel beyond Paddington than any other termini. It's about 81%. But we're also now seeing a lot of people in North Kent, in Essex, in East London, contemplating train journeys out of Paddington in the way they perhaps would never have done. A day trip perhaps from Abbeywood to Oxford, or someone who's living out, say, near Ilford, who wants to go to Bath for the day. It's just a much easier proposition for them. So we're seeing the benefits of that flowing through as well.
Look, that's really interesting. One issue, though, on the Elizabeth line, and maybe this is an issue relating to the interaction with TfL services. HS2 goes to Old Oak Common, and then it goes on to Euston. But there is a debate now as to whether or not it really will stop at Old Oak Common instead. We've got a 6 train per hour potential platform there, because it was never designed to be a terminus. It's all designed to be a through station. If it becomes a terminus, that either the station box has got to be completely redesigned, which I don't think is a feasible thing, or we end up with a massively restricted service on HS2. But you've got the problem with stacks of people getting out and changing at Old Oak Common. A view on that? I mean, Old Oak Common, it just doesn't work as the terminus of HS2, does it?
I think we're very good in the railway at making things work, Richard. So I think we could make it work. Whether it's a sensible outcome, I guess, is a more interesting question. I mean, you know, Birmingham to London, getting out at Old Oak Common. I suppose it will depend on where people are headed. I mean, there are some places in London where the journey time from Old Oak Common versus the journey time from Euston, bearing in mind the speed of the Elizabeth line, won't be radically different. I mean, Old Oak Common into Paddington is about a 4-minute journey. So I think we'll have to see. But yeah, I mean, I think Euston would clearly be better. And I mean, I was talking earlier about how busy the Elizabeth line is, and a lot of those trains that are coming up from the west, whether they're coming from Heathrow or Maidenhead or anywhere else, they're full and standing. So the people who want to go in from Old Oak Common to central London are really going to have to get on the trains that start at Old Oak Common, and actually TfL need, I think, about another 6 trains in their fleet to be able to extend the Elizabeth line service out, and none of that's been authorised. And of course, there is the option of going in maybe on the limited Great Western service, but that'll only get you to Paddington. And if someone's going from Manchester to London, the cancellation of phase 2 means their journey's already going to be about half an hour longer. The journey time savings less than half an hour, and if they're going to chew a larger amount of that up, getting from Old Oak Common to central London, I almost wonder if when I retire, I'd set up an open access business to run trains on the West Coast into Euston, because it might be a better option for people, actually.
Well, I was about to ask you that very question, Mark, that will people not just stick with a classic route rather than faffing around up and down escalators?
Well, they won't, unfortunately, because if all the Manchester Londons are going via HS2 at Handsacre Junction, there really isn't the capacity to put too much more on the existing line. There will be south of Tamworth and Lichfield, but not really anything north of it. So the whole thing becomes a bit problematic. You mentioned Great Western electrification, which was never quite got to where it was originally intended to do, seemed to take forever to do, cost a load of money. I mean, it's what we've got now is, I presume, is good, but is it a sort of an example of how we've, as an industry, we've forgotten how to do major projects?
Yeah, and I think I'm not an engineer, but I think one of the things that I saw with electrification was it took quite a long time to get the team together, to recruit the right people, to bring the experience in. And certainly what I saw was, as the project progressed, things actually got better. I mean, the last bit of electrification we did on Great Western was Reading to Newbury, and they actually flew through that. And I had the slightly bizarre thing going on my mobile phone ringing and people cancelling possessions because they'd done all the work quicker than they thought. Now, clearly it wasn't like that at the beginning. And it seems to me a very bizarre response to that is then to disband the team. And again, although they're doing some work up north, if we want to start putting electrification back in on Great Western, we're going to have to reconstitute that team. And you can have a debate, for example, about bits of railway like Newbury to Bedwyn that were never part of the scheme, and whether Bedwyn should have been done and how important that is. But I think to suggest that Oxford and Bristol were sensible places to delete from the electrification project is really, really difficult. I took another famous railway podcaster, who I won't mention, out in the cab of one of my trains recently, and we were going from London to Oxford, and we were looking at the fact that actually a large number of the masts for the electrification project to Oxford are in the ground. The foundations are there, and people just walked away from that and left it half finished. Because effectively the money ran out. And, Bristol is one of the fastest growing cities in the UK. It's a source of enormous economic growth for us, and somewhere that desperately needs a better train service. So not to get the electrification in. I mean, with the IETs being by mode, it gives us that flexibility, but the trains perform so much better on electric. And of course, if we'd have had electrification into Temple Meads, it would have allowed us to look at running things like Cardiff-Bristol local services with electric trains. So, I think from my perspective, a missed opportunity. But, I mean, I understand the concerns in the Treasury about cost, and clearly it would be foolish for anyone to say that that project was well managed, I think, particularly towards the start. But also quite a lot of money spent on, dealing with the robustness. I mean, one of the great things, having been through some nasty weather recently, we have all sorts of things to worry about with weather on Great Western, but we don't have to worry about the OLE falling over. And I think if the world of international politics and international relations was ever to deteriorate to a nuclear war, then at least the electrification masts on Great Western would still be standing at the end of it.
I mean, it's quite a dark thought, isn't it? But you make a very, very, very important point, which is our existing network was designed and built and upgraded at a time when we didn't have the same issues in terms of climate resilience. Looking at the CP7 settlement that's just come out, where Network Rail seem to have got less for CP7 than they had in CP6, which was also, and for those who are listening who have no idea what I'm talking about, a CP is a control period, a period of sort of 5 years when Network Rail get given a chunk of money by the government for operations, maintenance and renewals of the railway. So we've just had the next control period announced, and it's less money than the last one, which doesn't sound very sensible in the context of a railway that needs more operational resilience than ever before. I mean, we're just storing up a problem, aren't we?
Well, I think the one thing I would say about the control period settlement is that it is good to have a control period settlement, and certainly, in the world of train operators, we'd give our back teeth to get a 5-year financial settlement that we could rely on. And I think Andrew Haynes has made that point. I think the expectation, Richard, on Network Rail over the next control period is that they will find efficiencies and cost savings. And I think there are opportunities. I mean, one of the things that's been going on in recent years is that, there's been a lot more standards and a lot more insistence on things being done in a certain way. And that is sensible to some extent, but it has, I think, made things more expensive than they need to be. And I think I know from talking to colleagues in Network Rail, things like the track relaying outputs vary quite considerably from route to route, and it's a lot more expensive on one route than it may be on another. So I think there is an opportunity for Network Rail to try and find savings. And I think, the costs of possessions, and there's definitely some work for us to do as an industry. to deal with this problem that, Network Rail take a possession at night to do renewals or maintenance, but they're only actually getting about 90 minutes of work done, because the rest of it is wasted in getting the possession set up and handed back, and there's a lot of contingency. So I think there are opportunities to have a look at that. But I think you asked that question in the context of climate resilience, and I think, I've been on the railway, as Nigel says, since 1989. I think this is something that I can clearly see changing. People who tell us there is no climate change, I think are clearly wrong. I mean, we're seeing more and more impact from weather, more severe storms than the UK has seen, and that's leading to issues. And of course, things like the Carmont accident have led to a much more cautious approach by Network Rail in how they prepare for weather, and when the railway's open and when the railway's not open, and things like speed restrictions as well.
Okay, well, look, I mean, an extremely fair point about resilience and preparedness, Mark, which actually sort of takes us on to a bit of good news, which might be an opportunity for the future.
Indeed. Just before I get to that, though, just to finish a point on the electrification, I remember the first trip I had on your railway, Mark, when the masts were going up, and was horrified at the tons of steel that were involved and the sheer variety of different numbers of masts. And I remember asking, shall we say, a very senior Network Rail person why they hadn't just bought an off-the-shelf German or Swiss system. And the reply has stayed with me. The reply was, well, yes, but our engineers wanted to design their own. And you can see, we know what we ended up with. But yes, there is good news to be had. There's more good news to be had. The Elizabeth line is a brilliant bit of good news. But of course, at the other end of the passenger experience, there's Okehampton, Mark. That seems to have gone extremely well. Stuart Calvert and his team seem to do a brilliant job of upgrading, relaying it and reopening it in record time. I mean, how's it gone? The numbers sound impressive. Just fill us in on the story.
Yeah, I mean, I think we are really pleased with Okehampton, and we've seen 600,000 passenger journeys since it opened.
Wow.
490,000 of those through to Okehampton, and just over 100,000 actually has increased business at Crediton, which was the station that was already served by the Barnstaple train. So I think that's a great success, and actually, the neighbouring line to Barnstaple has grown 20% since COVID as well. Interestingly, the yield is actually 50% above what we forecast, because we're seeing more long distance journeys. I think we thought most of the business would be local journeys into Exeter, but actually it's driven quite a lot of traffic to London and so on. So we are very pleased, and the train service is there, but we've also focused quite heavily on restoring the station at Okehampton with a visitor centre. We've also done some amazing work. I say amazing, I think it's amazing, with the bus links. So Devon Council have worked very closely with us to restructure their supported bus network into Okehampton, and we've got bus links to some of the places that we don't yet have a train service to. And I don't know if we're still allowed to talk about the National Rail Awards, Nigel, but Small Station of the Year there. So that's good. And of course, we've now moved on to talk about Okehampton Parkway. And Stuart Calvert and the team at Network Rail and a number of other people did do a great job. Of course, it wasn't a reopening from scratch. I guess the open secret is I was running a train to Okehampton every Sunday in the summer since 2009. But we have completely relayed the track. And as you're probably aware, it ended up in this very curious corporate structure where we had a branch line in Devon, owned and operated by the Iowa Pacific Railroad in the US, and that went into receivership. It was bought out, and we helped facilitate that deal with Network Rail. And then we made the case with the first of the Beeching reopenings. The Restoring Your Railways Fund was used, and actually there haven't been many others behind us, but we've shown that it can be a great success, and we're very pleased with that.
It was brilliant, and I was particularly impressed with the extending the reach of the railway by that work you mentioned with the bus services. And yes, of course, you're still allowed to mention the National Rail Awards, Mark. I seem to recall handing you an outstanding personal contribution trophy in, what was it, 2017?
I think it's behind me, actually.
I thought it was there, just above the 50.
Well, I was just going to say, I mentioned in the intro that you're a Class 50 super fan, and there's one on your shelf behind you. Because I grew up with them double-headed through Preston in advance of electrification. It's why I used to go to Preston.
Are there any colour pictures of that, Nigel, or is it all just black and white?
Yes, boom tish, as they say. Yeah. But what about extending the reach of Okehampton even further, Mark, say across Meldon Viaduct and to Tavistock and back to Bere Alston, the northern route as a bypass for Dawlish?
Well, I have to say, I mean, my views on this are not always the most popular in the southwest. But I think, if we're going to reopen the railway from Okehampton to Tavistock, I think the business case for that is really going to have to be driven by the business on that route, and the case for it being a diversionary route, I think, is relatively weak. And actually, I mean, the work that Network Rail have done at Dawlish to improve resilience, and the next phase of the work, I think, will make that a much more resilient railway. But I think we're here in an environment of really constrained finances, and I think we just need to recognise just how expensive some of this stuff is. And the railway track bed, for example, from Bere Alston to Tavistock, the railway only owns 80% of the land, and getting hold of the other 20%, I think, is going to be quite difficult. And I would much rather focus on improving some of the existing services in Devon. I mean, if you take the Okehampton and Barnstaple services, they leave the main line at Cowley Bridge Junction. They're on a single track bit of railway through to Crediton. We're still using old-fashioned tokens and train staffs to control the service. We're constrained with our speed. I mean, I think there's 10 minutes to be taken off the journey time between Exeter and Barnstaple by not having to stop for token exchanges and for train crew to operate the level crossing. And I can achieve that with Network Rail at a fraction of the cost of building a new railway. So if someone's going to come along and build a new railway, or they want us to try and help them, then we'll certainly have a look at it. But I think the focus for me is on very much trying to improve what's there. But let's see what happens.
I can see Richard nodding away. I think you'll find a sympathetic ear with him on that one.
It will, because it's such common sense, right? I mean, what Mark has just said there is spot on in terms of looking at how you can improve what we've got. Tends to have a much more impressive sort of marginal case than something new. It is expensive and it is difficult. That doesn't mean, and Mark's saying the same as I would, I think, it doesn't mean you should never ever look at it. But I would certainly say let it not distract us from the task of improving what we've got. I just wanted to pick up one quick point, if I may. You mentioned about Dawlish and resilience there, Mark, which is really good. It's been battered in the last week or so by the latest storm, Kieran. And how did it cope? I mean, did the work? I saw a photograph of the footpath that was damaged, but the railway looked okay.
Yeah, I mean, the physical infrastructure held up very well. We're pleased with that. We have had some issues with the more modern trains with electrical equipment on the route, so there's some work to do with Hitachi there. But yeah, it held up well. And I think, I mean, the other thing, Nigel and Richard, I guess, while we're talking about the Southwest and talking about building up the current railway, I guess I would just like to throw into the debate, over the last 15 years up to COVID, we've seen 121% growth in our customer numbers on the branch lines in Cornwall. Wow. And what we call the Devon Metro, which is the trains that bring people into Exeter. And of course, Exeter has one of the biggest universities in the UK. It has the UK home for the Met Office. But we've seen 120% growth there. and that hasn't involved building lots of brand new railway lines. Yeah, we've put a passing loop in on the Falmouth line. We've opened some new stations in Devon, but compared to the sums of money that people are looking at around HS2 and some of the money that's proposed for some of the projects in the north of England, these are tiny sums of money. And I think, going back to the debate we were having at the beginning of this discussion, I think if we could be released to do more of this type of stuff, we could actually see some really impressive improvements in revenue and passenger numbers without having to spend huge sums of money by railway investment standards. And that's something I'd very much like to see.
Some modest improvements with a biggish benefit, which is got to be good to see. Okay, Mark, that's really interesting stuff. We're going to go back to Richard now, and you might want to get your wagons in a circle, because I know for a fact he's been saddling up a couple of hobby horses. So, Mr. B, off you go.
Hobby horses, I don't know. I mean, just one thing on the point that Marge just made about that 120% improvement, which is absolutely superb. I had a chance during the summer with a family. I conned them a bit, really. I said, we're going to go to Lou for the day, and they didn't realise that involved going on a train down from Liskeard. Cracking to see. Lovely little branch line, good load on the service that I did, and it's just fantastic to see those assets being used more and more. So no, listen, congratulations. I not so much. I don't know if hobby horse is right. I suppose
here it comes.
Well, it's just sort of slightly cheeky questions, I think. Really, first one is the sleeper service, and I did say once to Alistair Darling when back in SRA days, I slightly cheekily, certainly tongue-in-cheek, suggested we might want to look at the Scottish sleepers as a potential cost saving. I'd never really understood why taxpayers subsidise people's hotel bills, I suppose, really. And he quite sensibly pointed out that he was also Secretary of State for Scotland, and that probably wouldn't have gone down terribly well. But you've still got the sleeper to Penzance. It's a great thing, but is it in a world where costs are so tight, a justifiable thing?
Well, it is a good question, Richard, and I think it's one that should be asked. And the sleeper costs us about £8.5 million a year to run, and I guess honestly, I suspect most of those people would still travel with us if we didn't have the sleeper. But the sleeper is really important in Cornwall, to some extent to Plymouth, but really important in Cornwall. And I think, what we've seen, some of those usage percentages that I was quoting you a few minutes ago, come from work that we've done with Cornwall to invest in the railway. And I think we're seeing more devolution in the railway now. And if you say to people in Cornwall, and you say to their elected officers, what's really important to you about the current railway, the sleeper's always at the top of the list. So I think we have to have some respect for what people believe is important. And the sleeper does allow people to do things that wouldn't be possible otherwise. The air service into Cornwall is pretty limited. It's often seasonal. There is currently a Newquay to Gatwick air route, but it doesn't have a really early morning departure, and some of the connections at Gatwick are not great because obviously it's not Heathrow. So we see people often going up on a Sunday evening. They're heading maybe for a week's work in London, or they're actually heading out on the Eurostar to places like Paris or Brussels, all people going to Heathrow. And people do value that. A lot of the tourists value it. Hotel accommodation in Cornwall, as you may have discovered yourself, is limited because they don't want to see the large-scale, development that places like Benidorm have had. You don't see towers of hotels on the on the beaches of Cornwall. So the sleeper plays a role there. It's really important locally. I mean, I'm just about old enough to remember what happened when British Rail did propose getting rid of the Fort William sleeper. There was a massive fuss, and one railway journalist who's ended up living, it was always lived in Cornwall, I think, ran the last campaign when the sleeper looked like it was under threat. But yeah, it obviously does require quite large amounts of subsidy, but again, large in some ways, but not as large perhaps as other sums of money that are floating around. But it's really a very valued product by the people of
and I do get that, Mark, and you that's beautifully answered. If I mean, as a I suppose as a proud northerner, it got me very cross when the HS2 decision was made. Not necessarily HS2 per se, but the fact that here was Westminster and Whitehall telling a region of the country what was good for it. And I suppose it's exactly the same with the sleeper. And I do take the point. And it is if that's what really matters, then we have to listen to that. I accept that completely. There's one other, though, if I may. I mean, one of the things that always used to surprise me with on-train catering back in Virgin West Coast days, and also with East Coast days, how expensive it is to operate. You still have a Pullman dining service. I mean, just for those who haven't tried it or aren't aware, it is sensationally good.
It is.
So let's be absolutely clear about that. But again, do you look at that and think, no, I can see how that drops through to the P&L. I can see how having that service makes more people buy tickets. The service itself is just without equal. But again, financially, does it stack up?
Well, I mean, we love the fact that we've got the Pullman dining, and I mean, anyone who uses it always talks positively, and we're actually in the top 1,000 London restaurants on TripAdvisor.
Wow.
With the
Congratulations!
I mean, I suppose I would say, look, at the moment we're only running it on 6 trains a day, and I run 1,600 trains a day. So, I mean, my marketing and comms people will be tearing their hair out when I sit here honestly and tell you it's only on 6 trains a day. But of course, that means the cost of providing it again is relatively small. And I suppose what it does is it brings a bit of a halo over the business. It shows people what they can experience, although they won't experience it on every trip. We have people travelling with us not because they want to go to Plymouth or Exeter for any particular reason in Plymouth or Exeter, but they actually want to come out with their friends or family and have a meal on the train, and they turn around and go back again. And I think it is worth reflecting that the whole usage of the Pullman has completely changed, which is why we don't do breakfast on the business trains to London. So Pullman used to be all about business people, and I have to say civil servants as well. I mean, 42% of civil servants in 2008 used to travel in first class, and people were able to put, breakfast, lunch and dinner in railway restaurant cars on their expense tab, and people can't do that anymore. So it's all about leisure business now, and it's about people treating themselves. And I think as we see more and more leisure customers, I think as a railway, we do have to think about how we appeal to the leisure customers. And I absolutely take your point, Richard, about the costs of it. But I think there is something for us to think about, the gap between what I'm doing on some of my trains and what some of the charter train companies, the fantastic Midland Pullman that's running with my old first class HST carriages. People are paying phenomenal amounts of money to travel on that and have a meal. And I think we perhaps need to think about how we do, plug into some of this, because there are some people out there who don't have much money who are looking for value for money, and there are some people who actually have got disposable income, and I think there's an opportunity for the railway. But yeah, at the moment, restaurant cars, very small number, it takes up a small amount of my catering budget. But I think it's the right thing to do to showcase what we can do and to bring that sort of halo across the business.
I'm so
Can
pleased.
I just dive in there for a second,
Yeah, absolutely,
Richard?
go for it.
Like you, I've used that service, and it is sensational.
Yeah.
I mean, I travelled with Mark, and we paid our way and all the rest of it, and the staff clearly love it, and they weren't pulling out the stops because Mark was on the train. You could see it was absolutely what they wanted.
I think they
to
might
do.
have been a bit.
Well, maybe a bit. But Mark's use of the word halo is really good. This is something that Christopher Garnett was very good at GNER, wasn't he? With, linen tablecloths and dining cars and the route of the Flying Scotsman. You can't value it, I suppose, as an accountant wishes to. But the idea that the Great Western Railway, the route of the Cornish Riviera, has got dining cars and Pullman dining and a sleeping car, and is that whole railway, has got a value, I think, and I think that value is worth having. And all power to Mark for putting up the case for sleeping cars and Pullman dining in the face of arguments doubtless
From
people
accountants.
like you, Richard.
I got that point, by the way. I got that loud and clear.
Who want to hit it right?
Yeah, I don't bring my finance team for their away day out on the Pullman. I hasten to add.
Okay, right.
But
I shall,
you know
I shall
what?
back off. Now your turn again.
No,
Richard.
but you're right. There was a point that Mark made, which I thought was spot on about that. I mean, we've seen everything that Jeremy Hoskins and the team have done with things like the Midland Pullman. I took my father out on the Midland Pullman earlier this year. We went up the Settle Carlisle, went up to Carlisle and back, and it, from what I experienced, it was basically just an excuse to eat an awful lot. I mean, it was fantastic, but you're right. The difference between that and Pullman, on your 6 trains, actually quite narrow, really. So you're absolutely right. Look, we're coming towards the end, and there's one thing that you guys have done. And I know, Mark, you were quite. This was a big thing for you. You got involved with the acquisition of large parts of the Viva Rail company and the battery technology trains, which is really innovative. And something that I know the late Adrian Shooter had been very heavily involved with. But I know it's something you're quite passionate about. I mean, how's that gone? Are we going to see more battery trains appearing across the network?
Well, I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to see a battery train on the Greenford branch in the early part of next year.
Oh, wow.
Great.
And I think, look, it was really tragic and sad, wasn't it, what happened to Adrian? And he rang me in his final few weeks alive and said, look, Mark, the company's going to collapse into receivership, and I'm just not well enough to do anything about it. Is there any way you can help? And Pete Wilkinson and I looked at this and said, well, actually, we're quite well advanced with this project now, because we'd signed up with Adrian and his business to have Viva Rail bring a battery train onto the Greenford branch as a trial. And what we're trialling isn't the train. I mean, we know that battery trains can work. What we're trialling is the fast charging technology that says when the Greenford branch is sat in the bay platform for 4 minutes every half an hour, there's enough time and enough power in the batteries that are on the ground and the charging rail to transfer that power to the train. And every time it comes, it connects automatically, charges and goes back. And that's what we're really testing. So I spoke to the receiver of Viva Rail, and we did a deal. And one of my team rang me as the deal completed. And they said, Mark, you're now the proud owner of 70 bean cans in a scrapyard in Worcestershire, because the deal gave us the battery train, the 2-car unit, all the technology, the intellectual property, and the rest of the Viva Rail fleet of D-stock. So I live here at home in Oxfordshire. I mean, I have suggested to Tanya that we bring one and put it in the back garden, but that's not gone down.
How did that
well.
go?
And we've also bought the West Midlands fleet that they took out of service, and they're currently stored at Reading. So anyone who travels past our depot at Reading will see those. And of course, those vehicles had quite a lot of money spent on them to bring their interiors up to a good condition. So we'll hopefully get the Greenford trial up and running. The charging rail is in place, the electrical equipment's in place. Network Rail have been, amazing with this, which is not something I always say, but they're really keen. We've got some really enthusiastic people in Network Rail. I don't know, who knows? Let's see how your green signals stuff goes. You could maybe come and do an outside broadcast from the battery train, and then if we can prove that it works and it works satisfactorily, I think the other Thames Valley branch lines like Windsor, Bourne End, Marlow and Henley, and possibly some of the stuff in Cornwall would be candidates for that type of technology as well.
Just for the benefit of the people who maybe haven't heard of it, you mentioned in passing there, Mark, that you put down a short section of third rail that the train runs onto into the terminus, and it automatically starts the charging process while it's sitting there, yeah?
Yeah, it's effectively, it's like three little bits of third rail all lined up together. And the train is programmed to connect to that as it runs into the platform. And it's charging from the point pretty much it stops to the point just before the driver applies power to leave again. So you're really maximising that turnaround. And of course, it's not difficult at all to see how a battery train might work something like a Paddington Bedwin service, where it would be on overhead power charging to Newbury, and then the batteries would take it to Bedwin and back. But it's much more difficult to see how a battery train could operate on a route with no electrification at all, and this is what we're testing really on the Greenford branch.
Well, that's great, Mark. Look, I think that's just about worked our way through the things of interest we particularly wanted to talk about, though I'm sure Richard will agree we could talk for the rest of the day and listen to you telling us about Great Western. I really take my hat off to you for the innovation, for the sticking with the Pullman dining and the sleeper car, and the fact that, if you've been MD since 2008, in all that time you're still pushing and pushing and pushing to create a better railway and more power to your elbow. So for now, Mark, thanks ever so much for coming along, and we hope to have you back as a guest sometime soon.
Yeah, thanks
for having me. No, thank you very much. It's been great to be here. Thanks.
Cheers.
Good for us too. Well, what about that, Richard? Another expert quietly talking common sense about an industry we love, and you just got to say, why can't they listen and just do the sort of things that Mark's wanting to do, because everybody would benefit, including the Treasury and the DFT, but somehow they can't see it. They don't want to give up control, do they?
No, it is depressing, but we are lucky to have people like him, let's be honest. I first met Mark in the cab of a Class 47, would you believe, when he was at First North Western and I was at the Strategic Rail Authority. I've known him ever since, worked with him at National Express when he was involved there, and obviously watched his career develop. He's I think he's brilliant, really, and he's solid, he's sensible, he's visionary, he gets on his own, if I say he's a grafter, I don't mean that in a disrespectful way.
No.
He really does, but he's a great networker, he's a great ambassador for the railway, and we should listen to people like him a lot more.
Well, all we can do is to continue to amplify what he thinks and all that sort of thing, in the hope that we can start making some progress at some point towards the things that, particularly the separation of costs and revenue, that is the big one, isn't it?
It is, because it means that the kind of stuff that he was talking about, those sort of smaller local initiatives, and again, without being disrespectful, because what they've achieved is fantastic, they become a lot harder where the two sides don't get aligned. However, having said that, I did come away, I don't know if you felt the same, with quite a bounce, about sort of, a bouncy step, because there's stuff that, despite all that, he's got done and he's getting done, and it's great.
But the cost of it is too heavy. A TOC MD who I won't name, who left the industry in disgust, told me not long before he left that he had a wonderful initiative that he reckons would have raised £3 million in revenues, and it would have cost £1 million to do. And the instant the DFT heard that, they said, "No, we're not doing it."
It's very sad.
And he left. We've lost him to the industry. He said, "What's the point where you can't bring forward a scheme which would generate £2 million?" Let that
Not
hang
great.
in the air. Let that hang in the air for a minute. Okay. Anyway, look, thanks for listening to this episode of Green Signals, and thanks once again to Mark Hopwood CBE for joining us to share his experience and insights, born of 34 years of railway experience, and there really is no substitute for experience. Do let us know what you thought of today's show on Green Signals, on Twitter, or X as we're now supposed to call it, or LinkedIn, I suppose, together with any suggestions of things you think we should cover and talk about. We're open to all suggestions. We want everybody to be a green signaller. Don't forget to like, follow, subscribe on podcast platforms and on YouTube. But for now, that's it. Do join us again next week for Green Signals episode 6. Don't know what it's going to be yet, because it's always topical and we choose it during the week. If you think you've got an idea we should follow that we might have missed, let us know. But for now, goodbye.
Goodbye.